welcome to another short professional development training. This time we'll be discussing rubric development, both the basic concepts of how to build rubrics and the special tool within Moodle that allows us to use rubrics when grading our assignments. Our agenda for today is why bother using these rubrics? What do they really do for us? Then we'll look at some of the developmental concepts brought in by Stevens and Levi as to how you can create better rubrics over the course of time. Then we'll look in depth at Moodle's tool for rubrics, both how to create them and then how to use them for grading and how to change them if need be. Just as a quick aside, on the left you see an example of the original use of the term rubric. It's the red writing in a text that is designed to give you the important points, the titles, or the directions if it's something like, say, a divine service. Why use rubrics? There are all sorts of reasons. You can see some of them listed here, but the bottom line is clarity. It allows you as a teacher to figure out what you want to see from your students in terms of your assignment, and it allows students, before they actually have to turn in the work, to see what basis you are going to use to grade them. Because of this increased clarity, you're going to have far less of an issue when it comes to graded assignments. Students will not be able to argue that, well, you didn't say you had to have this many references, you didn't say that I couldn't have spelling errors, yada yada. The bottom line is it allows teacher and student to communicate about an assignment before the work is actually done toward completing that assignment. And that really helps in achieving student success. Now, as a secondary benefit, because we've gone to the trouble of creating rubrics, then we should get much more consistency between instructors teaching the same course, or even between instances of the same course taught by the same instructor. This helps because the more consistent we are, the easier it is for us to, say, measure student achievement over time or student achievement within a given class. So let's say you've decided to use rubrics. Well, that's great. However, you have to develop them. And Stevens and Levy said there were 4 steps in this process. The first one is reflecting on what you know of students and what you know of previous instances of that particular assignment. Of course, the more you've taught, the easier this is. You've got a larger historical framework to work off of. But in most cases, you can kind of guess what's going to go on. If it's a written assignment, the student's going to make spelling errors, or if I'm using APA, they're going to make APA errors. Maybe they don't complete the assignment, or they miss the assignment, whatever it may be. You sit down and think about what it is that students do both right and wrong in your assignment. And notice I'm saying in the assignment, not in assignments in general. I mean, you can use concepts from your history, but you want to really focus them on the assignment that is right in front of you that you're writing the rubric about. They're very specific. So once you have this pile of possibilities, you develop them into a list, and then take that list and you break it into particular groups, and you try to determine what does this group really mean. If I look at these descriptors, what are the descriptors telling me that I'm looking for in the assignment? And that's the labeling aspect of what they're describing here. Once I have this set of labeled groups, labeled descriptions, if you will, then I can try it out in an assignment. And you need to kind of try and tweak and try and tweak. It's rare you're able to get a perfect rubric first time out of the box. But if you do take that rubric and you tweak it and tweak it and tweak it, eventually you have a very powerful tool you can use without a whole lot more effort. And that's what we're really aiming for. As you can see at the bottom of the slide here, the assignment should be driven toward the learning outcomes, and therefore whatever you're using as a measurement to determine what's a successful assignment should also be driven toward those learning outcomes. Let's talk about rubric components. There are really 2 basic components, but you can look at it as 4 parts of a puzzle. The first thing we need to come up with is the task description. Even though it's the assignment itself, the clearer I make the task description, the easier it is to write the rubric, and the more likely it is the student's going to be successful. So we don't see it here on the page, but realize you need to write more than simply a title of what it is you want the students to do. You have to write a very detailed assignment out. Once we have that written down, the next step is to figure out the scale of performance. These are the columns of this particular matrix, and you want to keep it fairly simple. We'll talk more in depth about this in a minute. but it's important for students to know what good behavior is, what bad behavior is in terms of the assignment itself. The next thing we look at then are the rows. And these are the criteria, the things that we look at when we're trying to assess the assignment. That's what we were kind of developing earlier when we were looking at the rubric. Finally, we're going to look at the intersection of the rows and the columns, the actual cells, and this is where we write the descriptions. This is very important because it's the cell we're going to be trying to match against the student's performance. So the clearer the cells are, the easier it is for us to grade and the easier it is for the students to understand. So let's take a look at the levels of performance, and then we'll take a look at criteria in depth. When it comes to performance, you want to keep it fairly broad, 3 to 5 levels at the most of performance. Now, Moodle starts you off with 3. You can add more, but I would recommend you start with 3, basically good, passing, and failing, or something along those lines. Extra detail doesn't really help you that much. Having 15 levels of performance is just going to make your job more difficult. It's not going to help the student achieve the goals. As you're writing those good, acceptable, poor, or whatever you want to call them, you need to have a descriptor for each one of these. What does good really mean? What does acceptable mean? What does failing or poor mean? You don't have to go in depth in these descriptions, but just enough so the student knows, okay, good means it's A and B work, acceptable means it's C work, and anything below C work is going to be poor. And you can tweak this as you go through this over time. So if these are the columns, then let's look at the rows. The criteria, the rows, are the areas that Stevens and Levy were talking about in terms of thinking about what the student needs to accomplish, how to get it done, etc. Now, it's up to you as to how many levels you want. Moodle starts off with 1, and you can just add and add and add. I would say you want somewhere between 3 to 7. If you go past 7, you're just getting too deep in the weeds, and it's not going to add clarity, it's going to add confusion. So the question to ask yourself as you're going through that list, the groupings that we had from Stevens and Levy, is which are the behaviors that are most important? Which groups should I be using as the rows? If it's an idea that's a little more nebulous, a little more covert, then I need to look at, well, how is that covert behavior expressed? I need to look at the actual assignment and determine if I'm reading this paper, if I'm looking at this lab, if I'm doing whatever. Can I describe what it is that's a really good version of the assignment, which is a really poor version of the assignment, which one's acceptable? As always, the measurement has to be relevant. If you're looking at learning outcomes, these criteria should be aimed toward those learning outcomes. If the learning outcome says that the student has to be able to communicate well orally and in writing, then I can hit them on things like spelling and grammar and APA format and references. On the other hand, if there are no learning outcomes that deal with writing or communication, and I'm giving them a writing assignment, there's really not a whole lot I can say about it. So it's important to align our learning outcomes with the assignments that we give our students. One last point here at the end. Make sure that, and this is part of the process of writing both the assignment and the rubrics, that you have provided the students the knowledge and skills necessary to accomplish this task before they're asked to accomplish it. It doesn't help for us to create an assignment that we know the student's going to fail just to get their attention. We have to teach first and then assess how well learning has occurred. Let's shift gears. Let's look at Moodle itself and the rubrics tool in Moodle. Moodle is context sensitive, meaning that we have to be in the right part of the software for us to be able to see the options we want to see on our menus. In order for us to have rubrics, we first have to have assignments. So you would go to the main page of your course, you would add an activity, an assignment, as you see here in step 1, and go ahead and type in the normal things you would type in for an assignment title, a descriptor of the task that's part of the assignment. This is really step 1 we talked about earlier. It's clearly stating what it is you expect from the student. As you're moving through the page that is setting up your assignment, you want to move down to where the grading box is and use the pull down to select rubric from the default of simple direct grading. Once you have accepted rubric, save the assignment and jump over to the side menu and open up the advanced gradings. Now you'll see, because you set up rubrics, that advanced grading includes define rubric. In the Defined Rubric page that opens, you'll enter the name of the rubric itself and the description. Now, this is just for you and your fellow instructors. Students will not see the name of the rubric, they will not see the description. But this way, as we build up a library of rubrics over time, you can look at these and decide as an instructor if there's one that pre-exists that you can just use and modify for your own class. So make sure the description makes sense. Once you have the basic description out of the way, you can move down into actually creating the rubric itself. It starts off with 3 levels, as you can see, of performance, and you start to add criterion. You can go in and modify not only what the criterion are, but also the descriptors for each of these various levels of performance. You can also add additional levels of performance, going out from 3 to 4 or 5. I would recommend odd numbers. Even numbers tend to cause difficulty because student work always tends to fall in between the middle of the 2 even numbers. But you can add levels by clicking on the box, or you can add criterion, row after row after row, of the various things you're looking for in the assignment. Once you've built your initial rubric, just simply click on the Save Rubric and make it ready. Once you have that, it's in the system, and then you have the options you see in the lower left here of editing the current form, deleting the form, or publishing it as a template so you can use it all over your course. So once you have your rubric set up and associated with this particular assignment, grading with rubric suddenly becomes incredibly easy. You simply look at the student work, you click on it to grade it, and the rubric pops right up. Again, the students can't see your definition there on top of the rubric, but they can see the rubric itself, and you simply point and click, as you see here highlighted in green. You can even, for each criteria, add in specific comments if you want to make sure the student understands why they got a particular grade or why they didn't receive the grade they thought they should. Please understand, no matter how well you've written a rubric, you're never going to have a perfect match between the narrative of these particular selection cells and the student's work. You're looking to see which block best represents the student work. That's why the descriptors are so important when you're writing the cells, both for you and for the student. This looks beautiful, and by the way, Moodle will take these clicks and convert them over into grades in the gradebook automatically. You don't have to do any math whatsoever. That is both the greatest benefit and the greatest danger of using rubrics in Moodle. For instance, let's take a look at this particular piece of work. This student received good for English usage, spelling, grammar, etc. They received acceptable for completeness and acceptable for critical thinking. So if this was a piece of work you were grading, what letter grade would you give it? A B, perhaps? A minus? B minus? Somewhere in the acceptable to good area, I would assume. However, when you look at Moodle's grading, something very strange happens. Because it's using a fairly blunt instrument in terms of points, suddenly this student who has marks of good, acceptable, acceptable, is getting a D grade. They're failing based on the rubric. Now, it's not that the rubric itself is bad. It's that Moodle's default point values are very, very blunt. For instance, if good is 2 points and acceptable is 1 point, that means acceptable is really an F grade. It's 50% of what the good was. Unsatisfactory is a 0. It's a very, very harsh grading of the particular student's work. Now, luckily, these green point values you can modify while you're both writing and later editing your rubric. So we can go through and come up with points that perhaps allow us to give a more reasonable grade to a student when using these rubrics. And this is what I was referring to about tweaking the rubric over time. You want to come up to the point where these narratives and the point values you achieve from the narratives are well aligned so the student understands why they got the grade they did. So we can modify these rubrics. However, if we modify these rubrics, there is one other thing we have to keep in mind. When you go in to change the rubrics, here you see I've changed the point values from 2, 1, 0 to 2, 1.5, and 1. You'll see this red warning sign that pops up. If you've already started grading, you can change the rubric, but the rubric will not automatically change the grades you've already made. You've got to go back through and update those by opening them up again with the new rubric, clicking on the appropriate boxes, and then saving it. That's what will actually update the score for the student. Now, these numbers are not arbitrary that I've picked. If good is 2, assume that's an A, then acceptable is going to be, say, a C level or a C plus or a B minus. It's whatever you would really go with. Well, if it's a C, 70%, that would be 70% times 2, 1.4 points. So I'm giving them sort of a B minus, C plus, or 1.5 points out of the assignment. Unsatisfactory is failing. Well, a failing score is typically 50%, so I take 50% of 2 points, and that gives me the 1 point. So now if I went through and used this rubric, I would get a number much closer to what I wanted to have for that assignment. And again, you can go through and tweak it until it's really ready. The students won't see it until you release the grade. Once you have it set up, however, it'll stay that way from every time that you use this particular rubric. So if you find it works really well, you can copy it over and use it in another assignment, or you can even copy it over and use it in a different course if you wish to. The bottom line with rubrics is this: they simplify the work for both you and the students. They standardize the work between courses and teachers. They do make less work for you. Yes, it takes a few minutes to set them up, but once they're set up, grading becomes much quicker. You tend to have far less blowback from the students where you have to explain your grading, and that allows them to focus on the work instead of on arguing with you. Always be aware, please, that the default settings are very blunt, and you need to make sure that you can tweak them in such a way that allows you to have reasonable grades based on the work that's being presented to you. The only way you're going to get any better at this is you've got to go out and play with the tool. So please go into Moodle, grab an assignment, and see if you can create a rubric for it. Worst case scenario, you may not like the rubric you created. Fine. Go back and make your assignment options for grading back to simple grading. You don't have to use the rubric. But it is a tool I think you find will make your life far easier once you get used to it. So I wish you luck. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to ask anybody in DE, and we'll be more than happy to help you. Thank you much, and hey, have a wonderful day.